We are obsessed with work, and it's making us miserable. Americans work more hours than our peers in wealthy countries. We work 6 more weeks on average than workers in France, and we even work more hours than workers in Japan. And according to one poll, many Americans would continue to go to work even if they won the lottery. And when we're not working, we're thinking about work. We're checking Slack messages or emails at night or on vacation. We bring our work home with us. When you meet someone new, you ask them what they do for a living. When you talk to a child, you ask them what they want to be when they grow up. And on top of that, we search for productivity tips to always try and optimize our life and try to do more. Research suggests that most of us are unhappy with our work, and so our obsession with work is not making us happy. The philosopher Josef Pieper calls this the world of total work. And in this world, we lose a lot of what makes us human. And that is what we're going to talk about today. In the late 18th century, Jeremy Bentham had a very bad idea. He envisioned a prison in which at all times a prisoner could be observed. And crucially, they would never know exactly when they were being observed. They would just always know that it was a possibility. This was called the panopticon. This idea is pretty popular. Foucault discusses it, and it's sort of filtered out into the public consciousness. But here's something that's easy to overlook. Bentham wanted to actually take these ideas and apply them to how we treat the poor. He wanted to create poorhouses for paupers, people who couldn't afford to take care of themselves or to pay their debts. And Bentham had this idea that what you could do was build a panopticon and teach these people how to work. He describes entire families being put to work, including children who were born there and who learned to work to pay off the debts of their parents. Everyone there would live lives of basically nothing but work. Bentham calculated that the profits from these workers would be 300% for men, 200% for women, and children would actually be the most profitable workers in the poorhouses. And all of these profits would be controlled by a company that Bentham proposed founding. As the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson documents in her book Hijacked, Bentham is just one kind of egregious instance in a long history of the development of something that we've come to call the Protestant work ethic. This is an idea that the most important value in our lives is our ability to produce, to work hard. And if you want to understand the ideas of the Protestant work ethic, where it comes from and what it does to us, we need to turn to the work of Max Weber. In 1905, Weber wrote the book, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber noticed a difference between the economic outcomes for traditionally Protestant regions of Europe and Catholic regions. And he wanted to try and explain this difference. He didn't think it was a matter of political inequality or discrimination, but instead attributed it to a difference in ideology. Protestant regions had inherited a view of work, which turned it into something holy. They had sanctified it. This primarily comes from theologians in the 16th century in the Protestant Reformation. The two theologians who arguably had the biggest impact to establish this view of work would be Martin Luther and John Calvin. We don't have to get into too many of the details, but it's important that both Luther and Calvin believed in a kind of predestination by God. God chose who was going to be saved. And when you're trying to figure out if you are one of the people who is chosen to be saved, well, you go and start looking for evidence. And very quickly, people started to think that material wealth was a sign that you were particularly beloved by God. Now, people are going to say that Luther doesn't explicitly say this or Calvin doesn't explicitly say this, but an important part isn't necessarily what the two individually believed. It's how their ideas live through history, because these ideas were not confined to a pulpit. They had wide-ranging effects on the culture. For one, Protestants started sending their kids to different kinds of schools. These were schools that actually focused on job skills, while Catholics were still sending their kids to schools that were more humanities focused. They would learn literature and languages, things that weren't necessarily economically productive. Wealth became a symbol of spiritual favor, but it also, you had a moral obligation to become wealthy through hard work. And these two ideas both persist to this day. In the most economically productive regions that Weber was studying, really everything became about work. This idea may have started with Luther and Calvin and the theologians of the Protestant Reformation, but it has a history. The Puritans really took this idea and ran with it, as did Jeremy Bentham. Even though Bentham was an atheist, Elizabeth Anderson compellingly argues that he is a continuation of this religious tradition. And these ideas survive to this day. Catholics, atheists, anybody is actually affected by them. Something like the Protestant work ethic is in the air that we breathe. When Josef Pieper, the philosopher who came up with the phrase, the world of total work, wrote his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, this is what he had in mind. Leisure is a really broad category for Pieper. He's following in the tradition of Aristotle, where leisure is a kind of openness to the world where one can passively receive knowledge instead of having to work for it. And when Pieper is trying to figure out where everything went wrong, he actually blames a different German. It's not Martin Luther, it's Immanuel Kant. Prior to Kant, Pieper says, the work of the mind wasn't really considered a kind of work, but Kant reconceptualized intellectual activity as a form of work. So even this one last little refuge, a thing that wasn't work, became work. Pieper describes this as a topsy-turvy world. And in that topsy-turvy world, we lose our capacity for leisure, which is one of the things that makes us human. It's actually really helpful here to go even further back at history and look at how the ancient Greeks thought about work. Work has a long tradition of being viewed as a kind of curse. You actually see that also in the Bible, fairly early on in the book of Genesis. But in the Greek world, work was seen as something that one tried your best to avoid. In her book, The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt describes the ideal for an Athenian male as being able to avoid work as much as possible. This would actually leave room in your life for the things that would make you human, like action and politics and philosophy. Now, this Greek view obviously has its problems. One of the reasons that Athenian males could try to avoid work as much as possible is because they had slaves to do all of their work for them. And that certainly has to be kept in mind. But what this really shows us is that there has been a profound shift in how we think about work. Work went from being a kind of curse in the ancient world to being the thing that practically gives life meaning in the modern world. And that, in short, is how work takes over our lives. Arendt describes this as a kind of inversion. First, we invert the traditional order between the life of the mind and the life of activity. And then within the life of activity, we prioritize labor. That's the kind of work that we do so that we can consume. It's not the kind of work that we do to build art or to tell stories. And it's certainly not action, which is a particular kind of activity for Arendt where you get to disclose your identity to other human beings. And for Arendt, this is a world that doesn't have time for art and leisure, but importantly, it's also a world that doesn't have time for human connection. And I think it's pretty clear that we live in this world. Even the richest among us at least like to pretend that they work. Sometimes they do it to keep up appearances, but actually there's some economic data that suggests that very well-paid workers actually work more overtime. At some point, we have to say that they aren't working out of economic need or necessity. They're working either because they want to increase their consumptive powers or because they feel morally obligated. And it's not uncommon to meet people who say that they don't know what to do with themselves when they aren't working. That feeling of a moral obligation is something that we invented. And really, we invented it a couple of 100 years ago, and it corresponds pretty well with the development of a mode of production that we call capitalism. Under this mode of production, in order to meet your material needs, you have to sell your labor. But eventually, it turns into selling your labor. It doesn't become something that you do so that you can go and do other stuff. It becomes something that you do for its own sake. This is a very useful idea to be filtering out through the culture in a world where we measure value by what we're able to produce. This idea just supports the system that we live in, where how we measure value is what we produce and what we consume. So let's go back to Hijacked for a second, that book by Elizabeth Anderson. Anderson understands that there is a tension here, because for many of us, when we hear about the idea of a work ethic, we just think about the idea of working hard. And many of us, admittedly, like to work hard. At least we like to work hard if the work is good. Anderson admits in her book that she is a bit of a workaholic. She chooses to spend her time working, and it gives her a sense of fulfillment and pleasure. And admittedly, I'm like this too. If I get to do a kind of work that I love, I will work for hours, and I like it. And also, and this is a bit darker, I feel a sense of guilt if I don't get much done. And Anderson admits that there is a positive side to the work ethic, where we can really emphasize the dignity of labor. But there's also a dark side to the work ethic, where we turn working hard into a moral obligation, which is often then used to exploit people and sometimes to blame them for their own poverty. So Anderson, throughout her book, is weaving this dual narrative about the work ethic. I highly recommend that you actually read the book for yourself, along with my other sources. They're linked down below. But the major takeaway is this idea that the work ethic has these two sides to it. There's the positive side, which emphasizes the dignity of labor, and there's the negative side, which can be used to exploit people and can make us all feel like we all have to work all of the time. So either we work in terrible conditions, but we're just thankful that we have a job, or we bring our work home with us. We check Slack and our emails in our off hours or even when we're on vacation. And we feel guilty when we aren't being productive. We even turn those other parts of our lives into another form of work, whether we're optimizing our sleep or our exercise. We're always tracking, we're getting numbers and metrics and setting benchmarks and working and working and working instead of just enjoying ourselves and living our lives. If you look back at the 19th century, you would actually see economists and philosophers who were incredibly optimistic about the future of work. John Maynard Keynes writes this essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he speculates that by the time he has grandchildren, by the time they're adults, they wouldn't really need to work more than maybe 5 hours a week. He thought the big problem in the future was going to be finding enough work to keep people busy so that they would be happy. And he estimated that we would work maybe 15 hours a week in order to just keep our hands busy. William Morris, the founder of the arts and crafts movement, actually speculated that we would only need to work about 20 hours a week. And Bertrand Russell agreed. All of that, though, would just require a slightly more equal distribution of who was actually doing the work. What you find in these writers is a genuine optimism. They think that the world of work is going to get better. We are living in that time period where their predictions can be tested, and unfortunately, we have found that none of them have come true. We have increased automation and we have become more productive than ever, but our working hours have only slightly declined. There are a number of factors behind that. Wage stagnation, increased consumption habits are a particularly deadly combination, but there is also just this ideological factor, this idea in the back of our heads that we should always be working. It's the latent Protestant work ethic in us all. That's what drives us to work all the time and to turn other things into work. And we should think about what we lose when we do this. We lose our capacity for leisure and idleness. I discussed this recently in a video on burnout. It should be linked somewhere where you can find it. We also lose our enjoyment of things like reading and the arts. Reading and art just don't feel like productive tasks. And we lose our ability to form social connections because what is less economically productive than just hanging out? But I would say the fact that these are not productive activities is actually what makes them so valuable. Let me get a little bit personal here. I mentioned before that I like to work, and that can make it sound like a purely good thing, but there's that guilt that I feel when I'm not working. I feel like I'm wasting my time and I feel like I'm wasting my life. I can read these books and encounter these ideas and I feel so good while I'm doing it, and I think that they're totally spot on, and when I try to put any of these ideas into practice, I find that I'm still working quite a bit, and I'm feeling bad when I'm not working. I need to work on that for myself, but like so many of our biggest problems, there might be things we individuals can do, but the solutions don't end at the individual level. Elizabeth Anderson thinks that the solution is a kind of social democratic system. William Morris and Bertrand Russell both thought it would require massive political reorganization in order to more equally distribute labor. All of these thinkers recognize that it's not just a problem of your mindset. It's not just a problem of how you think about the world. It's a problem about how all of us choose to live together. Now, I think all of us should carve out time as we are able to not work. When I was a kid, I had a dream of being a comic book artist. At some point, though, I stopped drawing. And look, I'm never going to be a professional comic book illustrator. I don't really have a desire to be either, but I would like to start drawing again. And I found a resource over on today's sponsor, Skillshare, all about learning to draw. When I was a kid, I was learning by copying out of comic books. I never really had a teacher to teach me how to draw. But in this class, Mimi Chow focuses on the fundamentals of drawing. These are things like form and value and even the art of seeing. Skillshare is the largest online learning community with thousands of classes from industry experts. You can find classes on creative writing, like this science fiction world building course that I thought was particularly cool, but also things on painting, illustration, graphic design, all sorts of artistic topics. There are also learning paths which offer sequences of classes that you can take. Here's another one for drawing, which goes over all of those fundamentals in depth, like proportion, form, and so on. The first 500 people who use my link will get a free 1-month trial of Skillshare. It's easy to sign up, and you can get started today.